Hello and welcome to another edition of Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University. I am Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of our election law program, and today I'm very happy to be joined by Terri Enns, Tony Goggin, and Matt Cooper, my colleagues in the election law program here. And it is midsummer 2025, and we're going to talk about a variety of topics that are current and just see what our reflections are on the status of how elections are being conducted today. I'll kick it off because I am interested in a few findings that have emerged from the survey of the performance of American elections conducted in the 2024 election. Now, this is data from 9 months ago now, and the data has been collected in every federal election since 2008, I think. But it takes a little bit of time to not only collect all the data, but then to analyze it and think about what the implications of that data might mean. And the MIT Election Data Science Lab, run by Professor Charles Stewart at MIT, just released their own analysis of that 2024 data about a week ago. And one of the things that is in that report and analysis, and this is perhaps not at all surprising, but nonetheless, I think noteworthy and bears a little reflection, is that in the 2024 election, the number of, or really the proportion of voters across the United States that took advantage of mail-in voting dropped off quite dramatically from the 2020 COVID-influenced election. And that in 2020, the proportion of voters who were using mail-in ballots was in the high 40% range. I mean, it was getting close to half the electorate. But that in the 2024 election, and comparing presidential elections is a sensible thing to do, that proportion had dropped down to, as I recall, just under 30%. Now, 30% historically is still a really significant proportion of the voters to be voting by mail-in balloting, but it's a dramatic diminishment in that number since the 2020 election. And it's a little more speculative to think about the implications of that shift, what the causes of it might be, and what it suggests about voting next time and in the future. But it is interesting, in my opinion, to now think a little bit about that shift and what it might mean. Let me pause there and just see if any of you have your own thoughts about that change from 2020 to 2024.
I do have a question, and that is, have any additional states gone to all mail voting, or between 2020 and 2024, was that number of states steady? Has anybody been paying enough attention to know whether there's been a change or not? Because that would matter, right? If a whole state changed versus just in a number of places it's going up. So.
Yeah, and one of the realities of the 2020 election is that in a number of states, measures were taken, and I put that in the passive voice because it varied from state to state in terms of who it was that was taking these measures, but measures were taken in a number of states to make it easier to vote by mail in response to the COVID pandemic. Some of those measures were temporary or limited to the 2020 election. So that alone might be some reason to see a drop-off in the proportion of voters who were voting by mail in 2024. That's sort of the inverse of your question, Terri. And I'm not aware, although I'll have to go back and look again, but I'm not aware that there were states that were making it easier to vote by mail in 2024 compared to 2020. It was really the reverse, I think. But I'm not sure that those changes were that significant. I mean, I don't think it was those changes in the laws and the regulations that surround mail-in voting that are primarily responsible for the drop-off from 2020 to 2024. I think it instead reflects that in 2020, more voters wanted to take advantage of mail-in voting as a way to avoid congregating at the polling places in the early months of COVID. Whereas in 2024, people were maybe even eager to participate again in that civic experience of going to the polling place with their neighbors and fellow citizens and voting in that manner. I also think that the media reporting of claims about vulnerability in mail-in voting that really, we saw this dramatic upsurge of news accounts and stories about claims of problems with mail-in voting after the 2020 or in the 2020 election. But that too likely caused voters to feel more prone, I suppose, to return to in-person voting in 2024. Anyway, those are my initial thoughts on that. Mm-hmm. What do you all think?
Yeah, one thing, Steve, that I think really is striking about both the 2020 election and the 2024 election is that even though the percentage of voters who cast ballots by mail fell significantly in 2024, and there were fewer opportunities in some places, as you said, than in 2020, turnout overall was still absolutely fantastic. The Pew, I just pulled up the Pew Research Center review of the 2024 turnout, and it was around 65%, which is just tremendous. 2020 was higher. 2020 was around 66%, which was the highest turnout election in over 100 years. And 2024 was one of the highest turnout elections of the last 100 years. So overall turnout, whether people are casting ballots via mail or in person, remains exceedingly high. And that's something that I do think at a time of polarization, when there's a lot of pessimism about the future of the democracy, at least in terms of people's belief that their vote still matters, I think there's reason for optimism. And people still think showing up to vote is important and worthwhile. So for the big picture, that's a source of optimism for me.
In fact, another piece of data in the report of the survey of the performance of American elections from 2024 shows an increase in public confidence in the election results. That is a higher figure coming out of the 2024 election than out of the 2020 election. And that too ought to be reason for confidence, or reason for hope about our electoral system, I think.
Yeah, I'm curious.
I hope that in hindsight, we'll look back at 2020 as an aberrational election, not just because it was conducted in the height of the COVID pandemic, but also because of the raft of unsubstantiated claims about problems in how the election was conducted. And that, the farther we get removed from that 2020 election, I think the more those claims that there was something wrong with the election continue to fall away. I mean, they were pretty quickly debunked at the time by a number of groups. But, to the extent those claims persist, and they do, we can find news stories within the last week about claims regarding the 2020 election. But I think those claims sound more and more forced, strained, and unsubstantiated the further we get from the 2020 election.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the 2020 election in many ways was a stress test for our democracy, how well it could perform at a time of maximum polarization during a global pandemic. And sort of inevitably, under those circumstances, whichever side won, the losing side was likely to, at least in the initial period, be skeptical of the results. And then what made 2020 particularly controversial is the fact that the losing candidate was Donald Trump, who obviously has a long history of making false allegations regarding rigged elections. So it was in so many ways the perfect storm. And the fact that we got through it is something that I think we shouldn't take for granted 4 years out or 5 years out. It's something that I think reflects so well on the institutions that our democracy is built on, and on, I would say, the common sense of the ordinary voter and ordinary American, that people, in the end, if people really believed that the election was stolen, would they have shown up to vote in 2024? I think the fact that a comparable number of Americans showed up to vote in 2024 as 2020 suggests that people in their heart of hearts still believed that the election system was basically fair.
And the record high numbers would, buttress that argument as well. I mean, if 2024 had been a significant drop off in numbers, then it would be a different analysis. But holding that steady, basically, with just a tiny drop off, tells me that, Tony, you're probably right, that people do, it could be for good reasons or for bad reasons, right? Think that they got to get out there and vote and do it. But at least there's some faith in the system that if they do that, their vote will be accurately counted. And,
Absolutely. And I think the fact that that a much larger percentage of voters cast their ballots in person in 2024 versus 2020 might also be the result of something besides the end of the pandemic. I know I personally like the experience of going and voting in person. And Terri, I forget because you and I, you were at UNLV last fall, and I was at Ohio State, and I know you were in part because we were together on Election Day 2024. But I forget if you voted in person or if you cast an absentee ballot in the fall of 24.
I'm pretty sure I was in person.
You were
that I went. I did it early, but in person.
That's right.
Because Ohio has early it's in-person absentee technically, but it gives you that. When it's a big election, it's a similar kind of large crowd of people in the same place with the same task that you get on election day. I could scroll through my photos and figure it out because it was a large crowd. So,
whereas I cast a ballot in Iowa absentee, and it isn't the same feeling, the sort of civic feeling you get from being there in person.
Yeah, I've argued for a number of years that I wish we could shrink the early voting period down, because I think the more it's a group of people congregated in person doing it together, the more you're reminded that voting is not just an individual act, it's a community act, that you're saying that the outcome is not only what I want, but I want to impose that outcome on the rest of y'all. So it's not just here's what I want for my family act. It's much broader than that. And I think when you're sitting in your home by yourself, filling in bubbles, it's harder to keep that front of mind. So, but that's just me.
I agree.
Oh, not just you.
Yeah, and it is a time of social isolation in so many ways. We see in lots of different contexts, surveys that show Americans are more socially isolated than they've been in generations. And so when there is an opportunity to all get together to do something, even if it's something that half of us, 50% of the country views it one way and 50% views it diametrically opposing way, there's something reaffirming about being there together, doing the same process we're all subject to reach an outcome. And that, I think, is something that really connects And it's even more special because it's a time of social isolation, because of cell phones, because of the internet community that so many people live in. And I think it's really good for young people who in many ways are the most, lots of studies suggest that the young are more isolated than older generations because they've grown up online. It's so good for them to see a collective expression of democracy at the polling place. So I agree, Terri, completely with you.
Well, the report and analysis of the survey of the performance of American elections has a number of other interesting parts to it. You can find it pretty readily by just Googling the MIT Election Data Science Lab and find their report and analysis, which again just came out about a week ago. I'll mention a couple other things in brief here. One is that even though the proportion of voters using a mail-in ballot dropped, and that means the proportion of voters voting in person went up, and even though the turnout was still quite a large turnout compared to other historical averages, the wait times for people who were voting in person diminished, both for people voting on election day in person, as well as for voters like Terri was just describing, who voted in person but before election day. That those waiting times on average across the country decreased compared to 2020, despite the larger number of people voting in person. That's also a reflection of good management by our election administrators and worth applauding. The partisan gap between Democrats and Republicans using mail-in voting also shrank. In 2020, there was a much more pronounced difference in the quantity of or proportion of Democratic voters using mail-in ballots compared to Republican voters. It's still more Democratic voters than Republican voters using mail-in ballots, but the gap diminished in the 2024 election. And there were other ways in which some of the partisan differences across different dimensions of the electoral process and attitudes about the election process were shrinking in the 2024 election. So again, it's a great set of data. And if anyone wants more information, just go look for the MIT Election Data Science Lab report and analysis. What else is on our minds these days?
Well, certainly in terms of election administration, mid-decade redistricting is in the news the last several days as President Trump has called on the governor of Texas and the Texas state legislature to redistrict in advance of next year's midterm elections. And now states all over the country are discussing, both red states and blue states are discussing the possibility of the very unusual, adopting the very unusual practice of redistricting in the middle of a decade. So I think that's certainly a topic worthy of discussion.
Well, what do people think?
Well, I like to remind people that districting is basically predicting how somebody in a particular house is going to vote, right? Because you don't know. And I think some of what I've read about at the initial beginning of the decade redistricting, you're going to draw districts that you think is, whoever is in the majority is going to do their best job at. We can do this many safe ones for our party and much fewer safe ones for the other party, pack all their people into these fewer places. And then there's usually not a lot of in-between ones left. And I think there is a risk at the mid-cycle doing it, that the only way to get more is to make less safe districts, right? Because if you've already done the really safe ones over here, many of them for me, 2 really safe ones for you over here, in order to change that, you got to make things less safe for your own party. So there is a risk involved.
But doesn't that assume that things are static from the beginning of the decade. I mean,
Well, here's a data question. When you do districting mid, what census material are you allowed to use? Right? Because
you're allowed to use anything you want, including the voting results from the 2024 election, which you didn't have.
Well, but that's voting results. But I'm talking about in terms of numbers. You don't get to say, well, the population in our state changed by up or down by this amount, so we can change the size of our districts. Can you?
For purposes of complying with one person, one vote, you have to use the decennial enumeration. Okay. That's true.
Yeah.
And you're right that if voting patterns were static, mid-decade redistricting would mean you'd have to be maybe, slicing things a little more thinly, making districts a little less safe. But if what you have as the voting patterns from 2024 look different than they looked in 2020, that alone could give you reason to redo the maps without necessarily having to sacrifice the security of a particular district.
That's true.
There's another fascinating element to this, because from what I've been reading the last 2 or 3 days, there are a number of Texas Republicans who've expressed concerns along the lines of what Terri said, that because there's another element, which is normally when this redistricting happens, the next wave of redistricting would be 2030, 2031, with the lines going into effect in 2032, which would be a presidential election, which would be a high turnout election. Whereas this would happen in the months ahead and go into effect in a midterm election, 2026, which is a much lower turnout election. And it's being driven, at least for the moment, by Republicans, by President Trump and potentially Texas, although Democrats will be getting involved in it likely. But what makes it so striking is that historically, Democrats were viewed as a party that did better in high turnout elections and Republicans did better in low turnout elections, at least for the last 25 years. But we now have very compelling evidence that those trends have completely reversed. That is, the Democrats have become the party of college-educated voters who are the voters who are most likely to vote, as Republicans have become the party of working-class voters. They're voters who tend to be lower propensity voters. It means that this is really kind of a high wire act for redistrictors, because this is not going to be a 2028 or 2032 electorate. It's going to be a midterm electorate. And so as you draw the lines, all lines aren't created equal. Suburban lines or suburban districts can be much more likely to see their voters actually show up to vote. And then an additional complicating factor in all this is that we're seeing with this class realignment of the two parties, we are seeing a racial realignment as our politics are becoming more racially diverse, which is a very welcome development. But it then means for both parties, when they look at a racially diverse area of precincts, neither party can predict how those voters are likely to vote anymore in a way that certainly 10 or 20 or 30 years ago have been very predictable, not anymore. So I think that's why there is an underlying layer of unease among both parties, or with regard to both parties, as they look at this, and among political leaders in both parties, because this is a moving target under the best of circumstances. And for redistrictors, these are the worst of circumstances because they're operating on insufficient information.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Tony. I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, there's an element of unpredictability to this. It seems like both with respect to, like you're saying, developing preferences in terms of populations of color, and also turnout. That turnout is also unpredictable. So yeah, that does seem like it's going to make the job of line drawing fairly complicated, and yeah.
It's also done by state legislators who have a different pressure point from President Trump. And then, the point is to redraw congressional lines so that the U.S. House is safer for Republicans. But at the same time, the people who are in charge of doing the actual drawing don't have the same stake in those lines. So I think it's also harder to predict who really wants to do this and how.
Exactly, Terry. And I think that's something that might be a point lost on President Trump when he's pushing this. It's not going to, just as you say, it's not going to be Mike Johnson drawing these lines.
Right.
It reminds me a little bit of the conversation that was occurring some months before the 2024 election about whether Nebraska, through its state legislature, might give up its district by district electoral college distribution. That Nebraska is one of 2 states that does not award all of its presidential electors to whichever candidate has the most votes in that state. Instead, it's done district by district for all but their 2 Senate-based presidential electors. And so the idea was that the Omaha district, which typically has gone to the Democratic candidate, could be flipped for President Trump as a Republican district, or if Nebraska didn't award its presidential electors by district and instead just gave all of its 5, is that what it was, presidential electors to whichever candidate won the state overall. And when that conversation began to really generate a little bit of momentum, then there was a comparable counterpoint, which was for Maine to respond in kind, because Maine likewise was awarding and continues to be set up to award its presidential electors based on candidates that won whichever congressional district. And that meant that there was an electoral vote in Maine that was going to go to a Republican, to President Trump in 2024, that could be reclaimed by the Democratic candidate, presumably, if the whole state's voting was what determined presidential electors. So now we're seeing something similar, as this idea of mid-decade redistricting is being pressed first in Texas, is to what extent will other states respond, and to what extent would Democratic leaders in Democratic-controlled states want to try and counter an effort like this? I don't know what's realistic. I just don't really know. But as Terri said, there's some risk involved, or could well be.
And it's very uneven in terms of the power of individual governors or legislators to redraw their districts. I saw a map today of the election laws across the country, and there are very different, as we all know, that state laws vary dramatically state to state, including laws governing redistricting. And as a consequence of that, once we go down this road, it can be very unpredictable about even which states are the states that will end up redistricting, whether they be blue states or red states mostly. And I think that point Terri made is just crucial, which is the state legislators are going to have in mind, first and foremost, their own political self-interest. But at the federal level, the Republicans right now have 219 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, an absolutely razor-thin margin. You need 218 to have a majority. And so if they get this wrong, the consequence could be potentially the Republicans could even lose the majority. So it really is, from the intersection of election law and political strategy, this is one of the most fascinating developments we've seen, I think, in many years.
As a matter of history, just as a historical note, we did not see mid-decade redistricting being conducted with any frequency previously. We had occasions when mid-decade redistricting was required, when a map was invalidated. If a court concluded that a particular legislative map didn't comply with one person, one vote as a constitutional requirement, or violated the Voting Rights Act as a federal statutory requirement, then a state would have to draw a new map, and that might happen at any point in the middle of what is the normal decennial redistricting cycle. So those kinds of mid-decade redistricting events did occur. And then there was a mid-decade redistricting effort, again out of Texas about 20 years ago, that generated a Supreme Court decision. This was before the Supreme Court finally decided whether claims of partisanship in how our electoral maps were districted violated the Equal Protection Clause or any other provision of the U.S. Constitution. Before the Supreme Court definitively closed the door on federal courts policing whether these maps were drawn in an unconstitutional fashion because of their partisan advantage, there was a claim made, a legal claim made to the federal courts that drawing maps in the middle of a decade for no reason other than partisan advantage was almost by definition a violation of the Constitution, that we should only be drawing new maps when we had new census data. And in light of that census data, to comply with one person, one vote, then we had to draw new maps. And that barring a judicial invalidation of those maps, states should not be in the business of then redrawing the map every time they had a new political advantage to be gained by doing so. And that claim 20 years ago failed. And that then leaves us in the position today of allowing states to do this if they wish. There's no judicial impediment, no legal impediment to them doing it if they want to.
Yeah, I guess this our second topic here doesn't leave me as optimistic about our system as the first one we talked about with respect to a high turnout rate and people being more comfortable with mail-in voting. This politicians in the middle of the cycle kind of fiddling with the lines makes me feel more pessimistic. But.
And to me, it's interesting that when Ohio, I'm not even remembering what year, but when we redid how our district lines were drawn, there was supposed to be a carrot and a stick involved in how to get bipartisan buy-in on the line drawing. And the stick was, if you don't get bipartisan support, they won't last very long. And you won't be able to predict what your district will be, and therefore you won't want to have to redraw lines midway through. So that at that point, that was thought to be a problem, right? It was something you didn't want because it was hard to know, where do I need to be living in order to run for Congress when I'm term limited out of my seat in the Ohio Senate? But clearly it wasn't really a stick, and clearly we're not really afraid of redrawing lines midterm and not being able to know what our lines are. So, but it wasn't that many years ago that was the argument.
That's a nice point. This notion that the legislators themselves preferred some degree of stability.
I guess we'll have to wait and see what actually happens. Nothing
yeah.
is
Yeah, because it may be that they do actually prefer stability, and all of this conversation we're having may go away, depending on what state level legislators want to do with line drawing.
And the polls show the public overwhelmingly opposes this. There are just partisan gerrymandering in general is condemned in survey after survey by supermajorities of Americans, Republicans as well as Democrats. And so there again is a danger here, I think, for the Republicans in doing something that, for Republican leaders, in doing something that their rank and file voters disapprove of, even when it advantages their party, which I think also, to build on Matt's point earlier, is a source of optimism at a certain level, that even in this intense time of political polarization, there's a shared bipartisan distaste for rigging the lines, not the election, but rigging the lines in a way that favors the party in power. So there are lots of little rays of sunshine out there, I think.
Yeah, I doubt it would do the Democrats very well either. I mean, given general opinion of that party, if they were to adjust lines where they can, in the states where they can.
Well, both of these topics have been timely and interesting. And the second topic is one we're going to continue to watch. We'll see how it unfolds.
Yeah, I'm certainly interested in seeing, just as a general matter, what happens in the fall elections. We have the New York City mayoral race, the New Jersey race, and Virginia, because those races, if we do end up with mid-decade redistricting, those races will have national significance, even in places like Texas, because as the country has developed this, Tip O'Neill said all politics is local, but we've really sort of turned into a country where local elections are nationalized. If we continue to see voters of color move to the Republicans, and there are a lot of local elections where we're continuing to see that, and we continue to see well-to-do suburbanites move to the Democrats in the November elections, that will be very recent political information that will be valuable to the legislature in Austin and Sacramento and everywhere else that they may end up adopting new district lines next year.
Well, we'll want to come back to this topic once we have that information, a few months away still. Well, thanks for being with us today. It's good to have a chance to kick this around with each of you, and I'll look forward to doing it again soon. So until then, be well.